The next pronunciation that we're going to be looking at is that of the letter Lord. Okay, and the letter Lord is, I feel, the most commonly mispronounced Arabic letter there is, right? Because it's got its own pronunciation, not similar to any letter in Arabic or English, right? So it is pronounced using the rear side of the tongue, so the back of the tongue towards the side, and the Arabic makharij for this is حافة اللسان مع الأضراس العليا. Right, so these five back teeth, the two premolars and the three molars at the back, these five here, are known as al-andras, right, in Arabic. And what this basically means, hafa means the side of the tongue, hafat al-lisan. Ma'a means to touch or to rest against these, and ras al-ulya, the top five back teeth. Okay, so what you're going to do when you want to pronounce this letter is your tongue is going to slot itself in between the teeth and the gum, right, of these back five here, the two premolars and the three molars. And the front of the tongue also, what you're going to do is you're going to bring the front of your tongue away from this area here. Okay, because when that happens, then the sound will come from the front of the mouth, which is going to make it sound like a full mouth dal. Okay, this is not what we want. We want the sound to come from the back of the mouth, right? So you're going to move your tongue away from this area. We don't want the tongue to be in the front of the mouth, but obviously your tongue, it needs to be controlled away from that area, right? So you need to bring your tongue to one side, right? So your tongue is going to look like this. You need to move it to the one side so that this area here is free of tongue, and so that it doesn't come out like a full mouth dal, right? So when you slot your tongue here on the side, you'll find that if you just put your tongue on the side here, there's no sound that's going to come out, right? The sound only comes out when you move the tongue downwards away from the pronunciation, right? So you'll stick your tongue there, nothing will happen, and when you move the tongue downwards, when it comes down from this pronunciation towards the bottom jaw, that's when the actual sound will emerge somewhere from here, right? So we don't want the sound to come from the front of the mouth. It needs to come from the back of the mouth. Lord, lo, lo. That's how it's going to sound, right? So you can pronounce it from the right hand side or the left hand side, so the tongue will shift towards the left hand side, or you can pronounce it from both sides. But when you pronounce it from both sides, be very careful not to allow the tip of the tongue to have any involvement in the making of the sound. The sound needs to come only from the back of the mouth. The next three letters that we're going to be dealing with, I've joined them into one pronunciation, right? So one makharaj, typically they'll have three different makharij. They all come from the same portion of the mouth, but they've been separated according to the involvement of the tongue, right? But what I've done is I've joined all three of them into one. So that's why instead of 17 makharij in this video series, we have 15 makharij, right? Because three of them have been joined into one. So it's called hafatul lisan al-amamiyya, right? What it means is the anterior edge of the tongue, right? So look at this diagram of the tongue here. When I'm talking about the edge of the tongue, I'm talking about this area over here, right? So it's not the tip of the tongue right in the front. It is the edge of the tongue, right? So it's on the surface. The anterior edge of the tongue, when it makes contact with the alveolar ridge, right, in certain ways, it will produce certain letters, right? So there's three letters that come from the alveolar ridge, which is this depression of the palate that we talked about just before we started this, right? So when the anterior edge of the tongue covers the alveolar ridge wide enough to cover four teeth on either side, right? So from one canine to the other canine, basically. When the tongue is wide enough to cover four teeth on either side, you will pronounce the letter lam. So you press the edge of the tongue on the alveolar ridge, right? And it's wider. That is the pronunciation of lam. So you can practice now the distinction between the L in English and the lam in Arabic. The lam is a bit of a longer letter. The next letter that is pronounced from the alveolar ridge is the letter noon. Okay, so noon is pronounced also when the anterior edge of the tongue makes contact with the alveolar ridge, but now the tongue is a bit narrower, wide enough to cover only three teeth on either side, right? So you're covering 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. When this happens, because the front of the tongue is upwards, blocking the sound from coming out of the mouth. So when the sound comes out, it can either go to out of the oral cavity, or it can come out of the nasal cavity, right? And because now the tongue is blocking this form of exit, it needs to go out of the nasal cavity. So when you block the sound with the tongue, when you're pronouncing noon, you produce a nasal sound, because the sound needs to come out from somewhere. And because the mouth is blocked, it will come out from the nose, right? So when you're pronouncing noon, the edge of the tongue must be on the alveolar ridge, but it must be wide enough to cover three teeth on either side. The last letter that comes from the alveolar ridge is the letter Ra. Now this letter is not like an English R. Okay, what happens with this letter is the tongue, the bottom part of the tongue curls over, right? And that is what makes contact with this portion of the alveolar ridge. This part and this part of the tongue will stick upwards towards the palate, right? And then the center of the tongue will be loose and act as a flap for which the sound to come out of, and that's what creates the rolling of the letter Ra, right? So if you can't roll your tongue like that, then you can practice by sticking up this sides of the tongue towards the palate and letting the air flow through, creating this flap in the tongue. Okay, so your tongue must basically be wide enough to cover two teeth on either side. So from here to here, right? The part of the tongue is going to stick up towards the palate here. The other part of the tongue is going to stick up towards the palate here. And the sound is going to come out from the center. So that is the pronunciation of Ra. Now, when you are pronouncing the letter Lam, because the front part of the tongue, this edge of the tongue, is up towards the palate, right? And it blocks the sound from coming out the center. So now the sound is coming here from your voice box. It wants to exit the mouth. Now, because it can't come here in the front, right? There's no a pathway for it to flow. What happens is it ends up diverging out the sides, right? So that is a characteristic of Lam, which is a sifat exclusive to Lam and also to Ra, right? For the letter Lam, when the sound comes out, it is met by a blockage in the front, so it will diverge out of the mouth. And when you have the letter Ra, the opposite happens, right? Because you're sticking um, the sides of the tongue, you're sticking it upwards, right? So there's no pathway here and there's no pathway here for the sound to flow out. So it's going to converge into the center, and it's going to come out through this flap in the tongue, which is going to cause that rolling effect. The next group of three is to do with the tip of the tongue, right? So طرف اللسان, which means the tip of the tongue, مع الثنايا العليا. الثنايا العليا means the top two central incisor teeth, right? So when the tip of the tongue, meaning this portion of the tongue, right? So now we're not talking about the edge, we're talking about the very tip of the tongue, makes contact with the roots of the teeth, which is where the teeth joins to the gums. We will pronounce three letters. The first letter being ta, the second one being dal, and the third one being to. Okay, so let's talk about ta. And its pronunciation is very different from a T in English, although it does sound relatively similar, right? So the ta it comes from the front of the mouth in Arabic. The dal is a bit of a harder sound, right? So what we're going to do is you're going to press the tongue hard against this area when you're trying to pronounce the dal. Also, when you're pronouncing a ta and when you're pronouncing a dal, the back of the tongue, this portion of the tongue here, is going to be downwards because these are empty mouth letters, right? However, when you're pronouncing a to, this is going to change. Remember, like I said in the start, when the back of the tongue is downwards, it creates a bigger gap for the sound waves to bounce around in, right? And that means the amplitude of the wave is higher, which means that the pitch of the sound that comes out of your mouth is also higher. And higher pitch means empty mouth. When you have a lower pitch, right, because your tongue is upwards, that is when we get a full mouth letter. So the to is the same pronunciation as the ta with regards to the front of the tongue, right? The front of the tongue, this portion, you'll put it here by the top two teeth. But the only difference is that the back of the tongue will rise upwards now towards the palate, okay, and create that fullness. So if you think about it, this is the tongue, right? The front of the tongue is going to be up, the middle is going to be down, and the back is also going to be up like that. So this is what it's going to look like when you're pronouncing a to. The next pronunciation we have is طرف اللسان مع الثنايا السفلى. Okay, so عليا in Arabic means on the top, sufla means at the bottom. Thanaya are the central incisors. So This pronunciation also produces three letters: sin, sod, and za. So what happens is the tip of the tongue makes contact with the tip of the bottom teeth, right? So I have this diagram which makes it a bit easier to see. So do it in red. This tip of the tongue here is going to make contact with the tip of the bottom teeth, right? So not the roots closer to the gum, the tip closer to where the teeth actually end. So the bottom two teeth, the tip of the tongue is going to come here and it's going to touch there at that point. And that's where we pronounce sin, sod, and za from. Okay, so sin is the same pronunciation as a S in English, right? Same pronunciation, same sound as well. A za is very similar to a Z, right, in English. So a sin is like a S, a za is like a Z, okay? And a sod is the full version of the letter sin. So when you're pronouncing sin and za, you can see the back of the tongue is downwards, right? But when you're pronouncing the letter sod, you need to pronounce sin, but also you put the back of the tongue upwards towards the palate. It will come up like this here. And what that creates is the fullness of the letter. So sin is the flat version of the letter sod. This is also a S, but it's full mouth. The next pronunciation we have حافة اللسان مع طرف الثنايا العليا. Right, so the front edge of the tongue will touch طرف الثنايا العليا, which means طرف, which is the tip of, and ثنايا العليا, which is the top two teeth, the central incisors. Right, there are three letters that come from this pronunciation. The first letter is tha, the second one is dhal, and the third letter is dha. So looking at tha, like I said before, it is like pronouncing the th in the word teeth. It's a soft th. Okay, so we're talking about the edge of the tongue again, right? So not the tip here. We're talking about this edge here, which is on the anterior aspect of the tongue surface. And what happens is this part of the tongue is going to make contact with the roots of these teeth, right? So you can see here in this diagram, even the tongue is sticking out of the mouth a little bit, right? This is the only diagram I could really find. It's not supposed to stick out so much, but it's supposed to come a little bit out of the mouth when you're pronouncing these three letters. So when you say tha, you'll notice that your tongue sticks out a little bit. Dhal as well. Dhal has vibration to it, but no airflow. Tha has no vibration, but it has airflow. So if you put your hand outside of your mouth and you say tha, you'll feel the air flowing. And if you put your hand outside of your mouth and you say dhal, you won't feel air, but you'll hear sound and vibration flowing. And now we have va, which is the full version of the letter dhal. So you say dhal, and at the back of the tongue, you push it upwards to give you that fullness. The next pronunciation we have is to do with the lips and the top teeth. بطن الشفة السفلى مع أطراف الثنايا العليا. So بطن الشفة السفلى means the wet portion of the bottom lip, right? So on your lip, you have the outer dry portion and you have the inner wet portion. Okay, so now we're talking about the wet portion of the bottom lip, which is somewhere here. And what's going to happen is that the wet portion of the bottom lip is going to touch أطراف الثنايا العليا. أطراف means the tip of, and ثنايا عليا, like we said, are these two central incisors. So the tip of the central incisors are going to come down and they're going to make contact with the bottom lip at the wet portion. And when you do this, you're going to find yourself pronouncing the letter fa. The next pronunciation is using the two lips, the meeting of the two lips, right? الشفتان means lips. So shafa for one lip, shafatan for two lips. The meme, the ba, and the wow all come from the lips, right? So like I said in the previous slide, we have the wet part, which is on the inside, and we have the dry part, which is on the outside. All right. So when you're touching the wet part of the lips together, so this part and this part, when they touch together, they are going to form the letter ba. So this is when you touch the wet parts. When you touch the dry parts, not necessarily curling your mouth over on the outside, right? But just as a natural touching of the dry parts of the lips, you're going to pronounce meme, right? Same like a M in English. This is the dry parts of the lips touching. The ba is same like a B in English as well. And wow is classified by incomplete meeting of the lips, right? So if you put a pen in the middle of your mouth and you try and hold it with your lips, you'll see that your lips will kind of like make a circle, you know? That is what we're aiming for. So when you say wow, your lips need to come rounded. The only two times you'll ever round your mouth for any pronunciation is when you are pronouncing a wow and when you are pronouncing any letter that has a dhamma. You'll round your mouth in on these two occasions. You'll never round your mouth for a full mouth letter. The final pronunciation that we have in these slides is something called khayshum, and khayshum means a nasal sound, right? So, like I said, certain sifat are arida, which mean um, temporary sifat, right? So under certain circumstances, you will make a nasal sound when encountered with certain letters, right? For example, for those of you who are familiar with Quranic Arabic already, so if you say inna with a tashdid, right? This is a nasal sound. So what happens is when you have a nasal sound, the tongue blocks some form of exit through the oral cavity. So, like I said, the sound comes here from the vocal folds, okay? And when it is pushed upwards, it has two forms of exit. The first form of exit is the oral cavity, which is where most of the sound comes out of, and the second one is the nasal cavity, right? So, in the event that the oral cavity is blocking the sound from coming here, remember this is all waves, it needs to come out from somewhere, it can't go downwards, right? It has to go outwards. So, if it's blocked at the oral cavity, it's going to come out of the nasal cavity, creating a nasal sound, right? So any nasal sound, meaning when you have a tashdid on a noon or a meme, and for those of you who don't know what a nasal sound is yet, don't worry, we're going to go into detail when we do sifat. But for those of you who do know, when you are blocking the sound with your ikhfa, with your ikhfa shafawi, with your idgham bil ghunna, things like that. Those are all nasal sounds, and the reason for that is because the A is forced out of the top because of the blockage of the oral cavity.